Good morning, welcome. We hope you're having a good time today at our show, at the 25th Annual Plum Island Surfcasters Fishing Show to benefit our juniors program. With us now we have Steve Gallant, a well-known North Shore fisherman. Steve's been a friend of the club for many years, and he's going to talk to you about what strategies to use in the upcoming season. So without further ado, Steve Gallant.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I'm going to grab the mic and hold that. Thank you to the Plum Island Surfcasters for having me back to speak to you guys yet again. So without further ado, here we go. So, my name is Steve Gallant. Some of you may know who I am. For those of you that don't, I've been a surfcaster here on the North Shore for over 15 years now. I grew up in Ipswich, was born and raised over there. I grew up fishing on a center console with my dad out in Ipswich Bay and out behind Plum Island. So I've been fishing these waters for a long time. I started surf casting later when I was in high school, and then in college I really got into it a lot more intently, and I've been surf casting pretty hard every season since then. For a few years I lived right over on Plum Island. I did a lot of surf casting for years on Plum Island. I lived 2 doors down from Surfland Bait and Tackle, right next to Mr. Moe's. Which is a whole different problem in and of itself, but that's another story for another day. I currently live in Gloucester, so I don't get up to fish Plum Island as much as I used to. I still try and make it up there to fish a few times a year, but the majority of my fishing is now down in the Gloucester, Cape Ann area. I did have my own guide service for a number of years when I lived out on Plum Island, and after that, Plum Island Surfcasting Guide Service. I am not guiding anymore. I still get inquiries every year, so I appreciate the inquiries, but I am no longer in the guiding business. I'm a current contributor for On the Water magazine. I write the monthly North Shore report for this area. I write feature articles for them. I had one in the Angler's Almanac this past winter about fishing soft plastics for stripers. I also am a contributor for Surfcasters Journal. I write articles for them on occasion. I do some video work for them. I've done a few videos in the past. You can check them out on my YouTube channel. The most recent one, Sink or Swim, is currently on Surfcasters Journal's YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. So that's a little bit about myself. So the North Shore, let's talk about the North Shore itself. I'm hard pressed to think of another area that is more diverse than the North Shore of Massachusetts. We literally, when I say we have every type of surf casting, we have every type of surf casting. We have open sandy beaches, we have giant estuaries, we have quiet tidal rivers, we have boulder fields, we have cliff rock faces, we have open sandy beaches, we have every style of surf casting you could hope to do on the East Coast, you can find right here in this little microcosm of the North Shore. For the surfcaster, there is a very wide variety of access here. It ranges from very easy. For example, you can go to Plum Island, you can go park down by the Captain's Ladies, which is one of the most well-known, well-fished surfcasting spots in this area. And you can park your car and you can walk right out into the sand and you have a great chance of catching a schoolie, a striper, a 30-pound bass, So it ranges anywhere from get out of your car, walk 20 feet to you can find beaches here that you can walk for miles and miles on end and have a stretch of beach completely all to yourself and everywhere in between. So we really have a diverse fishery here on the North Shore. And opportunities of all different types for surfcasters. We are home to several river systems here on the North Shore, a lot of which support herring runs. The herring runs aren't what they used to be, but we still have some of the rivers that do have good returns every year. The Parker River still has a decent showing of herring every year. The Merrimack still gets herring. The Essex River still gets a decent showing of herring. Again, it's not like it used to be, but these rivers are rich in all sorts of bait fish. They dump all sorts of nutrients into the surrounding bays. It makes it for a very nutrient-rich area, and it's very attractive to bait fish and to large stripers as well. We still get, we used to, obviously, everywhere used to have a lot better numbers of large resident summer fish. We still get our resident summer fish that show up, and so when I'm talking about resident fish, obviously striped bass are migrating up the coast. Throughout the season, they kind of find different stopping off points where they sort of end their northward journey, and that's about as far as they make it for the season. A lot of people refer to these as kind of their summer residencies. So different schools of fish end up in different areas, and they kind of hang out there for a majority of the summer. We used to have our own pods of very large summer fish that would show up here, and they would go to the same places year in and year out. Those fish still show up, but they're not in the numbers that they used to. And there's a lot of other contributing factors as to why fish don't distribute themselves through our waters the way they used to. We'll touch on some of those other factors as to why those fish aren't distributing the way that they used to. That being said, it's even more important now to practice good catch and release practices. Obviously, with our new slot limit, we cannot be, we're releasing all of the larger trophy fish now, but it's more important than ever to handle those fish, properly and to ensure that, they have the best chance at survival that they have. It's more important than ever to respect the spots that we're fishing. That means that you're not posting blatantly spot burning photos on social media. It means that when you go to these places, especially in the middle of the night, or if it's a heavily trafficked area, that you're being respectful to the area, you're being quiet, especially if you're in the middle of the night. Don't be loud, don't be slamming car doors if you're in a residential or a neighborhood. Pick up your trash, don't leave trash in the parking areas. This is the kind of behavior that gets us kicked out of surf casting spots. We lose access to good spots when that happens. If you pull up to a spot and you see that there's only a couple parking spots at that spot, and there's already a few fishermen parked there, don't go parking illegally down some side street or on someone's lawn, because they're going to call the cops and get all of you towed, and then in another month there's going to be no parking signs there. So, just use some discretion, especially at some of the lesser known surf casting spots around here. Let's try not to ruin a good thing. So our season, we're a little over a month away from schoolies showing up once again. For me, I usually start my schoolie hunt around here the first week of May. There have been years if we've had a unusually warm spring or a really mild winter. There's been years that I've gotten in the last week of April. There are people that hold overfish around here. I don't hold overfish. There's plenty of other, means of fishing that I enjoy, and I'm ready for a break from stripers. So I don't really have much intel on holdover fishing on the North Shore, but usually come the first week of May, I'm out there poking around the marshes with my schoolie rod, looking to get the first schoolie of the season. May, especially the first few weeks of the season, it seems like it's a game of waves when they show up. It can be really hot fishing for a tide or two, and then that wave of fish kind of continues their migration north, and it dies right off again. So, especially early in the season, it seems like the fish tend to move in waves or pods or schools. They're not very well distributed yet, so like I said, it can be very feast or famine early in the season. Generally, the first few weeks of May, usually the size starts to increase. By the end of the month, we'll have some better fish starting to mix in, some slot-sized fish starting to get in there. Usually by the first or second week of June, we start to see some bigger over-slot sized fish moving into our waters, some 20-pound class fish. In my opinion, the spring and the early summer is a much more consistent time of the year. It's a little more predictable to figure out where the fish are going to go. It's partly due to water temperature and what the fish do when they show up. It sends them into certain areas, so they're a little easier to target as long as you know where to look that time of the season. That and the fact that the fish are showing up, you have different waves of fish showing up every tide, every week. So it's an exciting time of the year to fish because generally the fishing tends to improve week after week. By the end of June, or mid to late June, we are going to have full-blown trophy 30, 40, 50-pound fish in our waters, depending on the bait that is in the area. If we have bunker in the adult pogies in the area, that will help determine where those fish go when they show up. The last few years, so the last couple of years we've actually had a pretty decent run of bluefish. For the years previous to that, for 4 or 5 years before that, it was a really, really poor showing of bluefish on the North Shore, which was disappointing because, as some of you guys know, the fishing tends to slow down midsummer, and a lot of times the bluefish will kind of fill that void and keep the excitement going when the bass doldrums hit in late July and August. For the North Shore, for our fall run, I and many people I fish with believe that the North Shore or fall run starts pretty early. Usually by mid to late August, we are already seeing fall movements. Bait fish schooling up and heading south. A lot of it has to do with the angle of the sun. The day is getting shorter. It's not that necessarily the weather has started to turn, and just the fish migration being what it is now, this being the northern part of the migratory route for a lot of these fish, they're already turning around and heading south come the end of August because this is the end of the line for them. Depending on the weather, usually in storms, our season will go solidly through September and into October. I've caught 30-pound fish into the end of October. So it was a few years ago I got close to 30-pound fish around Halloween. So yeah, we do get big fish in the late season. That being said, the fall I find is a much more inconsistent time to fish. It is very feast or famine in the fall, and it's very bait driven. So those fish are hot on the heels of whatever bait that they are keyed in on, whether it be peanut bunker or mackerel or silver sides, spearing, herring, whatever it is they're on, they are in close pursuit of that. And if you're not finding bait in the fall, you're probably not finding fish. Storms can also wrap things up a little quicker. Usually October, mid to late October, we get a big hurricane or a nor'easter. A lot of times that will put the end of the season quickly into motion. So equipment that I use. First part of the season, usually the entirety of the month of May and even a week or two into June, I'm using a light schoolie setup, 7 to 8 foot rod. There's no need to be out fishing, in my opinion, the majority of the schoolie season with a 9 to 10 foot surf rod. It's not nearly as fun, and for the size of class of fish that are around, it's total overkill. So you're more than fine with a 7 to 8 foot schoolie rod for the majority of May. Once the size starts to consistently increase, usually by June, when I'm starting to think about big fish, I'm pulling the big sticks out, the 9 to 10 foot surf sticks. Usually I use anywhere from I use Van Staal reels, so anywhere from a 100 to about a 250 size reel, depending on the size of the rod that I'm using, or the size of the surf and application that I'm fishing. Again, don't fish. You'll see some guys that like to fish really light setups for big fish, and kind of brag about how light a rod they caught a big fish on. It's tremendously bad for the fish to fight them for that long and to push them to the point of exhaustion. It really makes it hard to revive them and for them to survive. So if you are targeting big fish, use the appropriate size tackle. Don't use overly light tackle for that. I use anywhere from 30 to 50 pound braid, depending. Usually earlier in the season, I'm running a lighter braid. If I'm fishing an open sand beach or an estuary, somewhere where I'm really not worried about getting tangled up in things, or I'm not worried about rocks or obstacles, I'm more inclined to go with a lighter braid. 30 pound is, for the most part, generally good for everything I do around here. I feel like I get a lot better casting distance with 30 pound braid. When I do fish off the rocks like Cape Ann or Rockport, I generally am using 40 to 50 pound braid, a little better abrasion resistance, just a little generally stronger. It's better to have a little more backbone in that sort of fishing. I do use a 2 to 3 foot leader, usually again 40 to 50 pound fluorocarbon, attached with a barrel swivel, helps eliminate line twist, which is important if you're fishing eels or the majority of baits. You really don't want to get any line twist in your line. If I'm fishing the rocks, I'm 100% using corkers or spikes all the time. I can't emphasize that enough, especially the rocks over on Cape Ann. They are extremely slippery. There's either bubbleweed on them or there's a very fine layer of this black like algae, and it is super slippery. So get yourself some spikes for safety's sake. I use a boga, no longer for weighing fish. It's only a 30 pound boga. The reason I carry a boga is simply for unhooking fish. Bluefish especially, but you don't have to have a boga. Any sort of cheap plastic fish grip is fine. It's just it's a means of, if you're fishing plugs, anything with treble lures, and that fish has a plug, awkwardly in its mouth, you can't always get a good grab on the lip. So it's hugely helpful. Or if it's dark, you're in big surf, grab that fish by the lip, and then you can, with your other hand, unhook it. It's much safer for you and the fish. Lures. So let's talk about some lures that I use. I'm a big redfin fan. I'm a big plastic swimmer fan. I caught my 50 pounder back in 2017 on a chicken scratch redfin. So I always carry a redfin in my bag when I can. There's other large plastic swimmers that are out there that are good. Rapala makes a actually pretty good plastic swimmer. Casts really well, swims about 4 to 6 feet down. Let's see. For plastic swimmers, I think I mentioned it on the next slide, but while I'm thinking about it, Mambo minnows. I used to be a big fan of Mambo minnows. I caught a lot of big fish on Mambo minnows. I broke a ton of Mambo minnows. I have a pile of Mambo minnows in my apartment with broken tails on them and disappointing fish stories. So beware of Mambo minnows. I will say that they do catch lots of fish, but they have a real tendency to break. They're not through-wired. Then again, neither is a redfin, unless you get one of the modified redfins. But I've never had a redfin break on me. I do like Danny's metal lips, especially in calm, shallow applications. I've had good luck with Danny's and metal lips on open beaches in quiet waters. I've also had good luck with them in quiet estuary applications. They tend to wash out sometimes if you have a really hard cross current. If I'm fishing a really hard cross current, I'm probably reaching for a darter anyway. Needlefish are great to have in your bag. I carry them especially in the fall. They punch through wind really great. They hold water in rough surf really well. It's really good. It's a great lure to keep contact with. Nice heavy needlefish. You're going to be able to cast that out in some really rough and big conditions. You're going to be able to punch through that wind, and you're going to be able to keep contact with that. For topwater, I'm basically a pencil and a spook kind of guy. For pencils, I don't really have any favorites. I tend to lose a lot of pencils, especially fishing off the rocks. So I've kind of stopped buying really expensive $25, $30 pencils. I love the Tsunami Talkin' Popper. That thing, it's plastic, it is loud. I think it costs $10. And it catches just as many fish as all those expensive custom pencils. Not that there's anything wrong with those. I love the, I still have a soft spot for the Guppy pencils, the Striper Maniac. I have a Striper Maniac pencil in my bag that has been in my bag forever, and it has caught a bunch of big fish. If Brian were here, he would have something to say about that, but for spooks, I like spooks, especially if fish are sort of in, so pencils are great if fish are in a more aggressive mood. You can move them faster across the surface of the water. If fish are kind of in that, in-between mood where they're kind of coming up and tail slapping at things and you're having a hard time getting them to commit, a lot of times a spook is better because you can really slow it down and you can really just tease it and annoy them and just really make that thing pause. And I've had fish that have come up and just kind of tail slapped at pencil poppers, and then you switch to a spook and you really slow that cadence down and put it right over them and just move it back and forth, like almost in place right over them, and they just can't resist it. The Doc Junior, I carry both of those in the fall. They're not the greatest casting lures, but man, the action on those is killer, absolutely killer. I carry a few bucktails in my bag, usually. Nothing more versatile than a bucktail. They punch through wind. You can fish anywhere in the water column with them. They're really durable, especially a well-made one. Also, the last few years, I've really been getting into using large, soft plastics, both eels, imitations, and paddle baits. We're going to talk more in depth in a few slides about those. Color selection, my color selection is very simple. It's light and dark, pretty much, with maybe a few shades in between. Black and blurple on dark nights. Chicken scratch, yellow or white on lighter, brighter nights or during the daytime. Occasionally I'll throw like a more natural mackerel pattern or maybe like a herring pattern in there, but for the most part, my color selection is very simple. I try to change out the hooks for VMC 4Xs if they're, very cheap feeling hooks. I fish a pretty tight drag, probably not as tight. If I'm fishing eels or soft plastics, it's real tight. I back it off a little bit if I'm fishing plugs or anything with, treble hook. Helps you a little bit with not having those hooks pull. Again, I mentioned beware mambo minnows. There's plenty of other lures out there that work. This is my small microcosm of the lures that I use, so there are tons of other lures out there that works. I just don't have them in my bag. For hooks, I try to stay away from using two treble hooks. I will generally have a treble on the belly, and then I'll have a single hook on the tail, whether it just be a single hook or an actual dressed tail hook with feathers or tied bucktail. I've tried the double inline single hooks. I've had really mixed results with those. I've had just fish after fish come up and slap at it and just miss, and then as soon as you put a lure out there with even one treble on it, you hook up. So, I've had, my middle ground has been a treble on the belly hook and just a single hook on the back. All right, so let's talk about soft plastics. So last season, I did not buy a single eel, which was a big deal for me. I was, for years, have been a big, big eel guy. Also for years, I've been watching guys absolutely, and a lot of, some surf guys, but a lot of boat guys, just hanging tons of big fish on the gravity tackle eels. And I was, I would think to myself, well, these guys are absolutely crushing fish on these giant soft plastics. There's got to be something to them. So last season, I ordered up a bunch of these, and I started off my big bass, portion of the season with these. I saved a bunch of money, obviously. Now that I live in Gloucester, I would be driving up to Surfland anytime I would need eels. There are places to get eels in between, but I like to go to Surfland. They let me pick out my own eels. I like to go to Surfland. It's a 45-minute drive one way, so it's an hour and a half, production to go get eels. So as much as I love the crew at Surfland, I was, looking for a way to, eliminate that trek up there once a week to get my eels for the week. So started my season with these. I fished with my fishing buddy, my fishing partner in crime. Wasn't really convinced, so he went and got his eels the way he normally does, and we started off our season. I was fishing these, he was fishing eels. I outfished him with the gravity tackle eels every single night we fished together. So I don't know if that's just a pure skill or if it's is something to it, but he made the conversion over to the gravity tackle eels pretty quick after that, and we didn't look back for the entire season. And do I feel like I caught less fish with them? Absolutely not. The newer materials that are, I've fished sluggos in the past, but there is something about the gravity tackle eels that just the action on these is insane. The newer materials just give it a look in the water that I haven't seen with a lot of soft plastics. Again, the gravity tackle one is the one that I use the most. There's a couple different hook styles. So there's one hook style that's more of a swim bait with a screw head. You can hook it weedless, like you would hook a soft plastic if you were bass fishing or if you were just rigging a weedless soft plastic. The style that I prefer is the exposed jig head with the jig head with the exposed hook. The areas that I fish aren't so weedy that I'm worried about running a weedless hook. I think you get a better hookup and you get better contact with the fish with the exposed hook. They come in a variety of different weights. You can get anywhere from like 2 ounces down to a quarter or a half ounce. So any sort of conditions, any sort of surf conditions, any sort of depth, you can find a jig head that will suit your application. They allow you to set the hook again as hard as you want. So when the live bait regulations changed a few years ago and they eliminated the J hooks, I was really disappointed because if you fish eels, you know that one of the best parts of fishing an eel is when you get that tap and you drop your rod tip, is then setting that hook as hard as you can on that fish. So with the circle hook requirements now, that's a thing of the past. You're not setting that hook hard anymore. You are now reeling down and just reeling into that fish. So with these, you can go back to setting the hook as hard as you want. And in fact, you should set the hook as hard as you can as soon as you feel that tap. It's also a little different from an eel in the sense that when you are fishing a live eel, you're fishing normally with a very high rod tip, right? So you cast your eel out there, and you're starting your really slow retrieve, and you're keeping your rod tip up really high. The reason you're doing that is because you're waiting for that thud or that tap from that bass to pick up your eel. When that happens, you want to drop your rod tip down quick, and then what I would usually like to do in that case was I would slowly slowly reel up my line, trying to not let that fish know that I'm there. I'm just trying to slowly bring up that slack and feel if that fish still has that eel. And as soon as I feel that little bit of tension on there, bam, I'm crossing that fish's eyes. So that obviously is a thing of the past, but it is back with this. So you are not, so a little differently, slightly different how I'm holding the rod when I am fishing one of these. So again, like I said, if I'm fishing a live eel, I'm holding my rod tip up very high. When I'm fishing one of these, I'm bringing my rod tip down further. The reason being is that as soon as I feel that tap, I'm pulling back on it. I'm not dropping the rod tip and giving it to him. I'm hitting him as soon as I feel that tap. So a little bit different. Another advantage is you can cast these guys as hard as you want. I put this guy on there. Once he's put on there, these hooks have some ribbing on here that helps the plastic from not pulling off. I also put a little bit of super glue under there. It's not coming off. You can cast this thing as hard as you want. You're not worrying about ripping an eel off. So I like that as well. So, lots of advantages to these. One of the other advantages to fishing a soft plastic like this is you are controlling where and how this thing comes through the water. When you fish a live eel, especially a really lively eel, the one that's got a lot of pep, and you just got them out of your eel jug or your pouch, put them on there, cast them out, that eel's first instinct is going to be to head straight for the bottom, which in a lot of situations that's okay. But if that's not where the fish are holding, if the fish are holding up higher in the water column, or if you are fishing around some sort of structure that you don't want that eel to get into, it's either up to you to then control that eel and start retrieving him, or you gotta let him go. So you're sort of at the mercy of an eel when you're fishing an eel. As you continue to fish an eel and that eel starts to die, when eels die, they tend to float. So if you're fishing a dead eel with no weight, a lot of times that eel is riding up very high on the water column, sometimes coming right across the surface. So again, you don't have as much control with a live eel. With one of these, depending on the jig head that I'm using, what I use for a retrieve, I can put this thing anywhere in the water column that I want. I can cast this thing out, I can let it sink all the way to the bottom, and then I can pick it up and I can absolutely just crawl it right along the bottom. I can cast it out and I can start retrieving it as soon as it hits the water, and I can keep it a foot underneath the water or anywhere in between. I can retrieve this thing and stop it and let it dive to the bottom. I can jig it back and forth so it's coming along, up and down like that. There's so many different things you can do with this. Obviously, it doesn't have the scent and the exact movement of a real eel. You're never gonna get that, the look of a real eel, but it does really good. You can also adjust your presentation color-wise. They make a whole list, or a whole variety of colors. You have blurple, you have very natural colors, you have pink, yellow. So depending on the night that you're fishing, the amount of ambient light, the amount of moonlight, you can really adjust your presentation. With a live eel, you're pretty much stuck with whatever nature gives you. You can adjust a live eel a little bit if you have dark colored buckets or light colored buckets. So if you take a live eel and you stick that thing in a black bucket and leave it for a few nights, when you take that thing out of the bucket, it will be noticeably darker than when you put it in there. Same thing as if you put a bunch of eels in a white bucket and leave them in there for a few nights, those eels will be noticeably lighter. They take on the color of their environment that's around them. Little insider tip if you're ever looking to change the color of your eels slightly. Paddle tails. So paddle tails have been another thing that I have been spending a lot of time fishing the last few years. They are endlessly versatile. They come in a variety of shapes, colors, weights, actions. They're similar to a bucktail in their application and their use. You can generally cast them out, work them really slow and low along the bottom, but there is a variety of different things you can do with them. One of the best little tricks that I found the last couple of years has been letting these things fall. As you're retrieving it, you can just stop. What I do is, so I'll cast it out, start my retrieve, kind of figure out where I am in the water column, maybe bring it up a little bit, and then occasionally I will just kill that as I'm retrieving it. And when it does that, it heads straight for the bottom, and not only that, but its tail, it's kicking as it's heading for the bottom. So it's a very natural, if you're having a hard time, maybe getting fish to commit, you're getting thuds and they're not committing to it. A lot of times that quick change of direction and heading for the bottom will trigger fish to hit. When I do it, I'll also try and, so it's sort of like if you're freshwater bass fishing. I don't know if any of you guys ever fish like a wacky worm or something. You cast it out and as that thing is falling, you're watching your line. You're watching your line and you're waiting for that line to sort of jump. And that means that a fish has taken that when it's on the slack line. So a lot of times when you watch these things fall through the water column, you will see your line jump when a fish hits it and this thing is heading towards the bottom. Another thing you can do, so when that happens, it's difficult to maintain contact with that. So what I'll do is as I'm retrieving and I want to let this thing occasionally drop, I will follow it down with my rod tip. So you'll be retrieving, stop, and then drop and follow it down with your rod tip. The reason you do that is because as it's falling and you're following it down, letting it drop with your rod tip, you will feel that thud transmitted right through the line, and you'll see it on your rod tip. As you're dropping, you'll see your rod tip go thud. When that happens, you lean back, you set the hook. So I've caught a number of fish on the drop, just letting this thing drop through the water column with a semi-taut line, so that when that happens, you're there to set the hook. The biggest thing with these guys is it has so much action, even at a slow speed. So this is one of the gags. There's a whole table of them out there. Check them out. These are the whippet fish. These are sort of a dual action. I like these because not only do you get the kick of the tail, but the way they design the head causes the whole thing to roll. So it's really got this super realistic action to it. And caught a lot of fish on these. Not only, these things are absolute schoolie killers early. You don't need anything. You could get a bag of these and be set for your spring for schoolies. But they catch big fish too. I'll show you in a second here. I have a video of a pretty large fish that was caught on one of those during the blitz. The other advantage to these guys is, especially if you're in a scenario like you are fishing a blitz of fish, obviously it's really fun to fish a top water in a scenario like that, but throwing an gags out there, letting that thing swim down, or letting that thing drop down and fishing that on the bottom of the school a lot of times will produce some of the bigger fish out of the school. So this was shot on Cape Ann a few years ago. This is me retrieving. You'll see a couple times a fish hits it. You'll see me miss the fish. I missed him right there. And this is a paddle tail again. And then I got him right there. So this was during a pretty, active circus feed that was going on. For the most part, they were all small fish, 20 to maybe 30 inches, but this ended up being right around 40 inches. So using a soft plastic, low and slow in an application like that will a lot of times get you a bigger fish out of the school. So let's talk a little bit about weather. Weather is very important for the surfcaster. I, a lot of times, try to use it to my advantage. The biggest thing that I look for in terms of weather is pressure changes. Specifically, large dramatic drops in pressure. Fronts and storms obviously will get fish chewing, but it's that change in the barometric pressure that really seems to set off the bite. So there's lots of different theories out there as to why pressure affects fish the way it does. The overwhelming theory that I have heard and makes sense to me is concerning their swim bladders. So all fish have a swim bladder, and the barometric pressure applies pressure to that swim bladder. The less pressure that is on that swim bladder during a low pressure time allows those fish to adjust their swim bladder more easily and move throughout the water column. So fish's swim bladder allows them to change their depth. During a high pressure situation, that added pressure on their swim bladder makes it very uncomfortable for them to adjust that swim bladder. So they're less apt to change their location, they're less apt to move around for food during times of high pressure, because it's harder for them to adjust their swim bladder. During a low pressure time, it's much easier for them to adjust said swim bladder. So they're much more active, they're moving around in the water column. That's the theory that I have had explained to me a number of times. I've heard other theories, but that's the one that makes the most sense to me in my brain. So a typical scenario, what I'm looking for in terms of, weather affecting the fishing, especially in the summer. If we've had a couple weeks of really hot weather, we're in a heat wave, we got high pressure, sun every day, no rain, and then all of a sudden here comes a line of thunderstorms, or here comes a big low pressure front with a day or two of rain. I'm getting out on the leading edge of that front, and I am trying to get out there safely. I mean, obviously if there's a line of thunderstorms, you have to be careful. But if I can get out there safely and fish that, when that front comes through, there's a very, very good chance. Some of the best nights that I've had fishing have been in torrential downpours when you literally could see the front coming at you, and it just gets those fish so fired up. Nor'easters and hurricanes in the late summer and in the fall also bring these dramatic pressure drops. For hurricanes and nor'easters, I like to fish the build-up to them. I find that the first few hours of a hurricane or a nor'easter, when the seas are just starting to build, tend to be the best. A lot of areas around here in a hurricane or something like that just become unfishable or just too dangerous, or you get too much debris in the water. The fish don't want to be in there. Yeah, for me, it's all about the buildup of a storm. The first few hours of when the winds start to pick up and the surf just starts to pick up, that's when you want to be out there. Moons and tides, obviously full moons and new moons are very important to the surfcaster. We get big tides. Fish tend to move around a lot more, be more active during these periods. If you have a limited time to fish, if you have to pick your days, I would pick my days around those periods. Both moons bring bigger currents and tides. Some people are like, I don't like the full moon, I'm more of a new moon guy. I caught my 50-pounder back in 2017, the night of the full moon. It was the night of the actual full moon. There was not a cloud in the sky. I did not have, when we were walking out to the spot, I did not have very high hopes for that night. I was like, it's not looking very good for us. I was hoping for some cloud cover. And there were some gigantic fish caught that night. So Don't let it being a bright full moon night stop you. It's definitely worth a shot. Some guys swear by the 2 before, 2 after. I have found this to be somewhat true over the years. You know, that being said, I haven't had nights that like the full moon has been dead, and those couple nights before, those couple nights after have been the most productive. So some people swear by the 2 before, 2 after, never on the night of. Cloud cover, obviously, during the full moon is ideal, but it's not a deal breaker for me. New moons, obviously, are very dark, so we're not really concerned with cloud cover. One of the drawbacks to the big tides, especially if you're fishing like an estuary situation, is that it tends to pick up all the debris that's been left on the marsh for the last month or so. I've had it so bad that some nights you can't even fish certain spots because there's just so much debris coming by because of the big tides that literally every single cast you're just getting stuff on your line. So one of the drawbacks can be just all the debris that some of the big tides pick up, but you know, it's not too often. Bunker. Let's talk a little bit about bunker and how important they have been the last few years. So in the last probably 5 to 6 years, we've seen a huge boom of adult bunker around here in the summer. It seems like they're showing up earlier and earlier every year. In my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, it has changed sort of the dynamic of how the fish distribute themselves throughout our area. Years that we didn't have these large schools of bunker, fish would just kind of settle into their usual summer patterns. You'd have some fish that would come in and they would cruise the beaches at night looking for crabs and things like that. You'd have other fish that would, you know, post up in the rivers and they would kind of come and go with the tides. But when you have these gigantic schools of bunker that show up off of areas like Plum Island or in Ipswich Bay, and they don't move for weeks on end, these fish find these giant schools and they just follow them around and they pick off, they pick away at them as they want. And think about it, like why would a striper go and scrounge around a gigantic sandy beach looking for crabs and crustaceans or whatever other random things it's going to find when it can go and get this extremely nutrient, high-calorie, meal that is an adult bunker, and they're just sitting there. They're just sitting there waiting to be picked off. So it's one of those things. It's like it's such an available food resource that it's pulling bass out of some of the areas that they normally would have frequented. Why would they go anywhere else? It doesn't make any sense for them. So these large schools of adult bunker have also been producing large schools of little bunker, which have been making their way south in the fall. So we predominantly see the peanut bunker in the fall, and they have been producing some of the biggest, most exciting surface feeds that we've been seeing. The reason for that being is that peanut bunker are accessible to all different size class of fish. It takes a pretty big striper to take down an adult bunker. An adult bunker can be anywhere from 3/4 of a pound to probably almost pushing 2 pounds, some of the big ones. So it takes a pretty big striper or a bluefish to get one of those things down. On the other hand, peanut bunker are much smaller. They are about yay big, and any size fish can swim into a school with its mouth open and get a big mouthful. So you see all different shapes and sizes of fish attacking the bunker schools, or the peanut bunker schools, so those surface feeds tend to be a little crazier. All right, so estuaries. Your best shot at a big fish in the estuaries, in my opinion, is June and July, depending on the water temps. Water temperatures are a big driver earlier in the season, so when the fish show up, even still in June, the water temperatures, the ocean water temperatures are still pretty cold by comparison. They're still usually in the 50s maybe pushing 60 if it's warm. But when those big bass show up, they are generally looking for some warmer water, and especially if they've eaten, they are definitely looking for warmer water. The big bass especially, when they show up and they feed, they will push up into the estuaries because the warmer water aids with their digestion. It's very hard for big stripers to digest food in cold water. So that is part of the big driving factor behind why the big bass will push up into the estuaries. It's also the reason why sometimes you'll see big schools of big bass in the estuaries, and they're not really doing much of anything. They're just sitting there, just milling around. They're digesting. They are not actively feeding, they're not actively hunting, they are digesting their food. If I find a good spot that's holding fish and bait during the day, chances are I'm going to give that chance a shot at night. It's important to try different tide stages in the estuaries. That being said, I find that the lower tide stages tend to be a little better. It tends to funnel the fish into a smaller area. Think of the estuaries in terms of choke points too. So if a fish get into a certain area, if you know that there tend to be fish in this certain area, think about, and this Google Earth is very helpful for this. Look at Google Earth. Look at the areas, look at the ways that the fish have to enter and exit an area. You can determine choke points. You're like, well, if fish are in here, they're coming in through one of these 2, maybe 3 places. It allows you to, target those coming and going areas. Moon tides, again, very important, but can be problematic for accessibility. So scouting is really important if you're out there fishing on the marshes. There's lots of little creeks and stuff to jump over, depending on where you're fishing. If you get out there and you're on a giant moon tide, sometimes that water will come right. I've been standing on marsh and been up to water that is up to my waist on a big moon tide. So if you don't know where you're going and you fall into one of those little creeks, you're gonna have a bad night. So that being said, I've also bumped into fish in knee-deep water on the marsh. So on big moon tides, those fish will push up onto the grass in literally a foot or 2 of water, up over the marsh edges. They will go up onto that marsh grass. Again, getting comfortable with spots, learning your routes out to spots is very important. Google Earth, use that, is super helpful for identifying spots. Another reason I'll use Google Earth is to try and identify areas of gravel or rocks. So any areas of gravel or rocks in an otherwise muddy or sandy estuary are magnets for fish, for bait fish, for crustaceans. Some of the best spots that I fish in estuaries are little areas of gravel or rock in an otherwise sandy, muddy area. It's important to keep estuaries in mind later in the season too. There have been years that we have had during a storm, a hurricane or a nor'easter, that fish and bait fish have pushed up into the estuaries in order to get away from the storm or to just get cleaner water. Also, you have a small push of bait that goes back up into our estuaries at the end of the summer and in the fall, and some of the fish will follow them up there. It's not as consistent as the spring. It's very inconsistent, actually. But sometimes during a big storm, if you're having trouble, if you're finding fish aren't in some of their normal haunts for that time of year, maybe give a quick look to some of your spring estuary spots. So the rocks. I typically am fishing the rocks later in the season, anywhere from late July, early August, right through the end of the fall. Like I mentioned, big fish are following the bait very closely this time of year. The best thing you can do in the fall, in my opinion, is to figure out a good route that you can drive that gets your eyes on a lot of shoreline. Get yourself a good pair of binoculars and just go driving looking for birds, looking for surface activity. The birds will be a dead giveaway in the fall, and it's pretty rare that I'll just go to a spot and blind cast in the fall, especially if I'm fishing during the day. If I'm not seeing birds or any sort of activity, I'm moving on. Unless I'm at a spot where I'm really confident that like some fish are going to come by, it's just a matter of waiting it out. But I'm very actively moving around, looking for different spots in the fall. I like, generally the top half of the incoming seems to be better on the rocks. I feel like it pushes the fish in, gets them accessibility closer, water is at its maximum depth. It tends to push the fish in. Although, depending on, the location, and that's why it's also important to scout the rocks, is because on an incoming or outgoing tide, it's not like a river where, the tide goes that way when it comes in and it goes that way when it goes out. On an incoming tide, it might be going through a cove in one direction, and then on an outgoing tide, it might be going through that cove in a different direction. So it's not as simple as just it flows in one direction on an incoming tide, or it flows in the, so it's important to figure out which way the water's pushing it. It will also help you determine when bait get pushed into an area, if they're here, if I see them down here, I know that the current's coming down this way along the rocks, I can post up in this spot and they're gonna come down here. Wind is very important when you're on the rocks. Wind, especially in the fall, when it comes quickly out of the east, will push bait into coves, and it will trap bait in coves. And if the fish find those bait in the coves, you are going to be in a very good spot to catch some fish. Eels and soft plastics can be a little tougher to fish off the rocks, especially the rocks at Cape Ann, for the reason that a lot of times you're up high on the rocks and it's a little harder to maintain contact with a lure like that or a presentation like that. I like metal lips, darters, needlefish. Those are all things that I reach for when the water is really rough on the rocks. The other thing, if you're fishing the rocks, and I see people do this a lot, is have a plan. By that, I mean, when you go down onto the rocks and you start casting, look around, think about, if I hook a fish right now, where can I land that fish? Can I get down there and safely get to that fish? I see guys all the time run down, and it's a blitz situation, and I get it. Like you run out of your vehicle, and there's a blitz going on, and you're scrambling down there trying to get off a cast, and they hook a fish, and then all of a sudden they look around and they go, "Oh my God, I have nowhere to land this fish." Or then they get themselves into a very sketchy or dangerous situation because they have a fish on and they're desperate to land it, and they didn't take any time to think about how they were going to do that. So have a plan, look around, be like, all right, if I hook a fish, I can get down onto that and I can safely, unhook them. So just think about those things before you make your first cast. The beaches, for me, the beaches are a summertime thing and into the fall. Usually mid to late July are the best for the beaches. Moon tides are absolutely go time. Scouting can be important, but for locations for beaches, I'm not looking for a big dramatic piece of structure. Sometimes the best spot on a beach could be a point that sticks out 10, 15 feet on an otherwise featureless beach. I will also tell you that fish cruise in way, way shallower than you think on beaches. I worked for years as a first mate on a 6-pack charter boat, Obsessed Charters, and we used to take customers in live lining mackerel, slow trolling them and just pitching them along the beach. And the amount of times that we almost beached ourselves, like just trying to get in there to catch fish, was insane. Like we were right in where the waves are breaking. Sometimes we would throw the mackerel up onto the sand and drag it back into the water. You could see the fish in the back of the waves as they were breaking. I promise that all of you, if you have fished out on Plum Island waiting at night, have waded right past stripers on your way to get 15, 20 feet out there into the waves that were breaking. They are right there, right at your feet. So there's no need to get super far out there. I mean, there are guys that, fish in wetsuits around here, and it allows you to, I used to fish on wetsuits a lot years ago. It allowed me to get out to sandbars that I normally wouldn't be able to get to in a pair of waders. But that fishery is a little different now, and I don't fish that way anymore. Areas that are close to river mouths are also extremely productive. We have a couple beaches around here that have very close proximity to river mouths, and at certain times of the year they are very productive, especially those areas that are adjacent to either side of those river mouths. Okay, that is all I have today. Thank you guys for coming out, and I'm going to open it up to questions.
What size jig head on the Gallant for you?
So it varies. I think that's probably, I don't know, a 7 or an 8/0 hook. This is a 1/2 ounce jig head that I have on there right now. I have everything from 1.5 ounces that I use out on the rocks in big, heavy, conditions, down to, I have some weightless ones, and everything in between. But generally, about the 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce seems to be what I have on most of the time.
How do they cast?
They cast great. I mean, obviously the aerodynamics of this aren't great, but you're not worrying about ripping it off like you would with an eel. So, and the little bit of extra weight definitely helps. Yeah?
Recommended brand?
The grabbing tackle has been the one that I've been using, a 13.5 inch.
No, I mean the jig head.
Oh, the jig head? They're also made by Gravity Tackle. Yep. Yeah.
So getting away from wetsuits, I was a little bit surprised to hear you say that. Is that because you're doing mostly rocks up on Cape Ann?
Yeah, it's partly because of the locations that I fish. I just haven't been getting down to fish on the sandy beaches anymore as much as I had.
But if you did, would you be back in your wetsuit?
Oh yeah, no, I still have my wetsuit. I put it on last year. I was only out there one night, and yeah, so I still, the other reason is that there's a lot more sharks around. Seriously, I know, it hasn't happened to me, but I know a few guys that have been casting at night and had 20 to 30 pound stripers bit in half that they were in the middle of fighting. So, and they're in areas that I used to wetsuit a lot. And, those areas for me haven't been as productive. There was a few years where the fishing really dropped off there, and as you say, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. So that's, I moved on, and I still go back there a couple times a year, but it hasn't been fishing like it used to. Yeah.
You said you use primarily bandsaw wheel type of rod.
I use Century rods for the most part. I'm a big fan of the Stealth. I think it's a nice, when I was eeling a lot more in previous seasons, it's the perfect eeling rod. It's a very slow action, casts an eel really nice, very parabolic bend, good for metal lips and non-aerodynamic plugs. I also like the Slingshot. It's a nice plug rod. So yeah, generally Century rods. Yeah?
On the gravity eel, do you usually tie direct, or do you use a tack on your clip?
So a lot of times I'll tie direct. I had a problem with, so the Gravity Tackle, the jig heads, it's a very thick gauge for your line tie, and I had a hard time getting it on the tactical angler clips. But what I did, if you take a split ring, I put a split ring, I don't know if you can see it, there's a split ring on there, and that makes it a lot easier to put on the tactical angler clip. So if you want to use a tactical angler clip, I started putting split rings on this. It makes it a lot easier to take them on and off. Little tip.
That's why I asked it.
Yeah, but then I do sometimes, because like when I would fish eels, I would tie direct. I don't know why. I think sometimes it was a better connection, or when you went to go set that hook, there wasn't any slippage of the clip, and I think sometimes that probably helps too to tie direct. So there are sometimes I just tie direct on these, but I do use the clip sometimes if I'm going through, if I'm experimenting with weight or color a lot, I'll have a clip on.
Steve?
Yeah.
So if you were going to use a teaser on, let's say, a paddle tail,
Okay.
should they be, a similar fish look, or could you have a paddle tail?
So you're talking about a teaser up the line, like a little red gill or something like that?
Closer fly or something?
Yeah, Clouser. I don't think it color, I mean, so when I fished beaches a lot, I used to fish teasers more, and I didn't find that there was any, are you talking in terms of like, should it be the same color as your presentation?
Yeah.
I don't think that matters, because what you're trying to imitate is a little bait fish being chased by a slightly larger bait fish. So I don't think it's important that they be the same color, but again, I keep my color selection pretty simple. So chances are they're going to be the same color anyway. But yeah, I don't think that's as important. Yeah.
Don't you use a swivel when you line the line?
Yeah.
You don't tie it?
No. I suck at tying whatever that knot is. That's the line to line. I don't trust it because I suck at it. And I think that the barrel swivel does exactly what you're trying to achieve, and it eliminates any chance of line twist. If you tied a knot, any sort of knot connection, you still have that chance of line twist. So in certain plugs will twist up your line worse than others. Or eels. Eels will twist your line up really bad. Yes?
What size barrels do you use?
Barrel swivels?
Yeah.
Pretty small. They're, I don't know what the size is off the top of my head, but they're generally like 75 to like 100 pound.
Okay.
Like,
I just bought some 100-pound.
Yeah.
They look tiny. to
they
me.
are tiny, but they're strong.
Okay.
Like, I've never, ever in my life broken a barrel swivel. Ever. Yes?
When you're using the paddle tails, you find that you're using more like the 6-inch size as opposed to the really large ones?
I have...
Or the small ones?
Yeah, so generally, like, as long as it's not schooly season, this tends to be the most productive size for me. They do have some giant ones. I'm curious to try some of the oversized paddle tails this year, but I've caught 40-plus inch fish on these guys, especially in the fall. Seems to be a great size. I think this is about the smaller size. This and the size below it are the ones that I use for schoolies. Absolute schoolie killer. Yeah.
Is there a difference in the type of water that you find the most success with those, or?
It varies. I do well on these, like quiet estuaries, just rolling it really slow along the bottom, occasional rod twitch. There's a picture, I'll go back a few slides. That fish was taken during a hurricane a few years ago on one of these. Probably this exact size, probably about an ounce, maybe ounce and a half jig head. So yeah, they catch big fish. That was during a pretty big storm, as you can see by the surf behind me. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Yeah.
Do you crush bars or keep them?
I do, especially early in the season, schoolie season. These guys are almost always crushed when I have them out in the marshes. A little later in the year, in the fall, maybe not as much. Trying to keep that big fish pinned, and it's a single hook, but yes, I do crush my barbs in the spring. Yeah?
Fluoro versus mono, and why, and what recommended brands? Just curious.
I use, what is the name of the brand? It's not the expensive stuff. I think it's the Andy fluorocarbon, not the pink stuff. Fluorocarbon is supposed to be less, they say it's invisible in the water. It's not quite invisible, but it's way less visible to the fish. It's abrasion resistant, a little bit more abrasion resistant than mono. Also, it doesn't stretch as much as mono. Mono floats also. Not that that really matters. I guess maybe if you're in an application where you're fishing a top water and you really want to make sure that it has the maximum float staying up on top.
I was
But I've fished topwaters with fluorocarbon, and it does not, a 2 to 3 foot section of fluorocarbon is not going to sink your topwater, or any plug for that matter. So, yeah. But yeah.
Do you fish primarily nighttime, or do you fish the dawn?
I fish a lot of dawn. My friend Brian that was here earlier fishes with me quite a bit. He's a really talented photographer. I fish with him quite a bit because, especially early in the morning, because we're trying to get photographs, really nice photographs, and the light is really nice then. But the fishing is really good at dawn, especially if we're fishing topwater off the rocks. That first hour of the day, you have a good shot at good fish, big fish, and you have nice lighting. If I'm going out purely though to just try and catch fish, I'm probably fishing at night. I would say probably 70% of my fishing throughout the season takes place at night. Probably the other 30% is in the fall during the day. Yeah.
So you talked about the changing patterns due to all the pogies being around these last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
What adjustments have you made?
Trying to follow those pogies around a lot more. Using imitations that are a little more in line with pogies. But it's been tough, especially for the surfcaster, because a lot of times those pogie schools are not within surf casting range. They're usually well outside of surf casting range. So you make the adjustments that you can, but aside from if you know where there's a school of pogies, going to that school of pogies, it's been more so just kind of doing a lot of the things that we normally do, and just there being less fish there, unfortunately.
What lures are you using, around those big schools?
Large swimmers, large pencil poppers, the Doc Senior. So anytime I'm around one of those schools, I'm using the biggest things I have in my bag. Something that's large profile and trying to imitate a large pogie. Couple more, and I've been told I have to wrap this up by 12:45.
Line color.
What's up?
Line color.
Line color, pretty simple. I don't think it matters a ton. I, for the most part, have, I think, on most of my rods, just like a moss green. I did get some bright colored line last year when I was out fishing off the rocks, but it didn't seem to really affect negatively or positively my catch rates, so.
What about brand?
Brand, I like the, what is it? Daiwa J-Braid. It's very, yeah, it's pretty economical, and it's cheaper than the Power Pro, and I've had good success with it. It doesn't knot up too much, and, yeah.
I got one point.
Yeah.
Have you noticed the presence of the bonita changing any behavioral characteristics?
Interesting. So the bonito that I've seen for the most part have been mixed in with schools of mackerel. And the bonito are also, for the most part, on the really small side. It would be cool if we got like a nice run of like some 2 to 3 pound bonito. That would be awesome. But for the most part, it seems like they are just mixing in with the mackerel. They're very much like mackerel. The bass are treating them like mackerel, but they're fast. They're very hard they're not a slow-moving bait fish like some of the other, like the pogies and stuff like that. So probably a little more challenging for the fish too, but I don't think it's overall changed like the dynamic of the fishery around here. All right, thank you. Oh, one more? All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.